So thank you for coming. It's a great privilege to be able to introduce Jack Rafferty, who's manager of Climate Giving, Giving Green, and so he's helping to work with Giving Green, which is based out of ID Insight, to try to evaluate what climate change organisations most effectively help tackle such a huge problem. So they're sort of like the give world for climate change, and Jack's working here in Australia to try to replicate what they've been doing over there, which has been amazing. So prior to that, Jack was one of the co-founders for the Lead Exposure Elimination project, which I think is just one of the biggest success stories from some of the EA ideas and EA's charity entrepreneurship program. They managed to have lead paint eliminated from an entire country within the first 12 to 18 months of their operation, which I think is just an unbelievable achievement for what was a small group of hardworking young people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Jack has to say today. If you have any questions that sort of populate your mind as you listen to Jack, then pop them in swap card. And if there's hopefully some time at the end, and I'll make sure I field those to Jack, so if I don't have questions about this. But otherwise, there will be a chance to just yell out, but if you pop them in swap card, then I can kind of batch them and talk at the end. So over to you, Jack.
Beautiful. Well, first off, thanks so much for coming, everyone. I hope you're all really enjoying the conference. It's been a blast for me so far. Today, what I want to be doing is I want to be talking about a few different things. I want to talk about, one, how we're going about identifying some really high-impact approaches to addressing climate. Two, I want to be talking about the unique advantages that Australia has. And three, I want to be talking about what we can actually do about that and what we're planning on, how we're planning on executing on some of these insights. And then at the end, I think we'll have probably 15 to 20 minutes for a brief Q&A. Then we can jump on in. I'll just let people take some seats. Beautiful. So before we jump into any of that though, there is, I think, a baseline question to be asked, which is, why do we think climate matters for EA at all? There are tons of causes that are quite popular or quite high scale, but aren't necessarily EA cause areas. And climate is one that, so the question is, why climate and not other things? There are a few things here. One, climate is a problem of just absolutely colossal scale, just in terms of short-term impact, in terms of the impact on both wild animals and on in developing countries. The impact of climate is expected to be absolutely huge. But then there's this other factor to it as well, which is people talk about climate as a potential existential risk. Now, there's some level of debate here where there is a reasonably strong case that climate in itself isn't a straight-up existential risk and isn't extremely likely to be causing extinction in the same way that, say, AI or engineered pandemic might. However, there are thinkers at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and different groups like this who are talking about existential risk now as being less of a siloed thing and more of an interconnected kind of thing. So it's not that nuclear war and engineered pandemic and climate change are three separate issues. It's kind of that if we live in a world that's been quite damaged by climate change, is that a world where a great power war is more or less likely? In a world that's been very damaged by climate change, are we more or less able to respond to a devastating pandemic? And are we more or less able to mobilize the resources to address AI? So a lot of these things kind of play into each other. And if we can kind of think, what can we be doing to stabilize the overall macro environment, then there's quite a bit we can do there to mitigate those risk factors, which can make us more able to just build a better future in general. So in the spectrum of ideas we've got, it's fairly non-controversial that climate change maps fairly highly. It's definitely higher than donkey sanctuaries, definitely higher than tobacco companies, but there definitely are arguments that there might be other existential risks that you'd want to prioritize first, partly just due to neglectedness. There might be some that are less focused on. However, there are advantages with climate as well, in that it is a area that is quite focused on already. Now, there are pros and cons to that. The cons are that maybe there's, maybe in certain areas there's less useful work to be done, in that a lot of the low-hanging fruit have been picked. People already spend something between 7.5 and 12.5 billion dollars on climate change, and I think I think in some ways this is a pro, in some ways this is a con. The pro is that if there is that much interest already, a lot of this is not being particularly well spent. And this is an area where EAs can be extremely useful, in that if governments and if philanthropists are already giving a huge amount to an area, and we can magnify that, then magnifying 7.5 billion to be 100 times effective is better than magnifying a dramatically smaller area. So there's some pretty exciting work to be done there, just in increasing efficacy in solving a problem that there's already a lot of effort being mobilized towards. And second, while climate is an area that's quite popular, there are a lot of different sectors of climate. And some sectors within that are quite neglected still. And that's kind of one of the things that I want to talk about today. So in essence, the goal of Giving Green is to be helping helping a lot of players in the space to maximize their impact. It could often be really difficult with climate and with a lot of problems in general, especially really large scale problems, to figure out what is the actually useful stuff that we can do. Like, what's the high impact approach to addressing a high scale problem? They can just seem totally intractable a lot of the time. So what we've been doing for the last few months, or what I've been doing for the last few months for Australia and Giving Green has been doing for the last few years, is doing research to identify and promote the highest impact climate organizations. We also do research that focuses on a few different opportunities, for example, business strategies, because there are a lot of businesses who want to give specifically to climate without being policy involved. Or we might have a lot of Australian donors who are particularly interested in climate work. So we've been looking for some specific Australian climate solutions as well. But we also give agnostic climate recommendations for just the highest impact organizations in the world. So essentially what we do is go through a reasonably complex research process to identify the broad strategies that seem most impactful, develop a long list of organizations, evaluate opportunities, narrow down the long list based on the strength of the teams, and then publish recommendations from there. Now, the features of the organizations that we look at map reasonably well to the EA kind of framework. We're looking at scale, we're looking at tractability, and we're looking at neglectedness. Climate change is, frankly, just a massive issue. And if we want to move the dial on a problem like that, then we need to figure out how can we have large-scale solutions. And in a lot of areas, this is true of climate, but it's also true of a lot of areas within EA. A lot of the most effective work, if you can figure out how to do really large-scale stuff by pushing levers that affect like large-scale change, then unless the costs scale with that, then you can have just an insane amount of impact by doing that. So one thing that we've found pretty consistently in a lot of different areas is affecting policy is absolutely huge, and accelerating technology is absolutely huge. If you look at the past with climate change, for example, one of the biggest things that's happened in the last 10, 15 years is the Inflation Reduction Act in America, which is the largest bit of climate legislation that's happened in the last 15 to 20 years, has completely changed the game with how America is tackling climate change. That was partly the work of a number of different NGOs, which have helped to accelerate a bunch of these things. Second, technological acceleration has been really important in terms of reducing the costs of solar panels, of renewable energy, of all sorts of different things that have then made these technologies accessible to the free market, so that they can be rolled out at scale. Those are two approaches that are slightly less legible, but because they can then move away from the NGO sphere, they can be scaled to a much broader degree and have much larger levels of impact. More legible stuff like direct emissions reduction can be really effective, but it's really hard for them to reach that scale that we need to actually solve the problem. Second, we look at tractability. We look at organizations that either have an incredibly solid theory of change or that have a strong track record of turning research and campaigns into progress. That either they've passed regulation and legislation in the past, or they have other similar signs. And second, we look at neglectedness, and we look at that on multiple different scales. So first off, is the organization able to usefully use more funding? And second, are they working in a sector that's neglected? Because there are certain sectors within climate that are far less focused on than others. If we break this down, this graph is actually from Bill Gates' book, which I strongly recommend. It's just a fantastic taxonomy of how to break down the climate problem. Now, what he breaks down is that there are basically 5 different really big sectors to do with climate change. You've got electricity, agriculture, transport, buildings, and manufacturing. And for some of these sectors, we're doing pretty well. Electricity and transport in particular, things like we've made a lot of progress in these 2 areas in a lot of different countries. However, there are some sectors like agriculture and manufacturing which have proven more neglected. Now, arguably, this is because they are also just more difficult sectors. Like sometimes things are neglected because they are more difficult and there's less hanging fruit to be had there. However, we're in a scenario where if we aren't able to tackle these, to tackle this 50%, then we're left in quite a dire situation to deal with climate change in the future. So the primary research of Giving Green has been focused on how do we deal with these neglected sectors, because these are the ones that are most going to affect our future, because the less neglected sectors are likely to get solved regardless. There are also other avenues, such as carbon capture, which aren't included in the emissions profile. Carbon capture is more to do with withdrawing emissions. So if primarily we focus on how do we stop carbon from getting up into the atmosphere. Carbon capture is more how do we bring it back down and how do we undo harm that's been done. So with that in mind, for our international recommendations, Giving Green has recommended a number of different organisations, from Clean Air Task Force to Industrious Labs, working on a number of different approaches. Some have been working on policy approaches to affect things like the Inflation Reduction Act. Some have been working on decarbonising cement and industrial emissions in China. Some have been working on decarbonising agriculture through the development of alternative proteins, or working on AMCs for carbon sequestration, or have been pushing to advance alternative energy technologies and things like this. But what I want to focus on today is our more domestic approach. I want to look at whether Australia has an important role to play in climate. Now, typically in our research, we tend to be quite country agnostic. The chance that any one country is the best place to solve a particular part of climate is relatively low. But sorry guys, I know this isn't a bio-risk talk. Sorry about that. Yeah, but so climate change is a massive global problem, and what we're trying to figure out is whether there is an important role for Australia to play, and how important is that compared to other areas. And ultimately, what we think that comes down to is when a lot of countries are thinking about climate, there's almost an intellectual trap that a lot of countries fall into, where what they think, even in the language we talk about climate, when we talk about carbon footprint, we always talk about the domestic impact of a country. We talk about, well, what are our emissions? How much electricity are we putting out? How much of this and that are we causing? And that's a useful rule of thumb to use, but rule of thumbs can also be misused. Now, the danger here is that if you're a country like Australia, even though our per capita impacts can be quite high, where the average Australian might emit a larger amount of emissions, we functionally just aren't that large a country. There's about 25 million of us. Even if we're large per capita, we emit something like 1.2% of the world's carbon. So even if we decarbonise that isn't a colossal amount of the problem solved. However, if we ask this other question of if we can think about how is Australia affecting global carbon emissions, then there might be things that are dramatically more powerful that we can do that people aren't focusing on, because the vast majority of funding and influence is going towards these more domestic approaches. So, what I want to talk about today is if Australia has something really unique that we can offer on climate. I think where that's going to be is because there is some area that we can perform better. There's something that makes us different, where we can execute on a particular type of solution that other countries are less able to execute on. So what I want to talk about today then is what's unusual about our emissions profile and what's unusual about Australia's unique advantages that would allow us to better tackle certain sectors of climate change than almost any other country in the world. Now, when you just look at our domestic emissions breakdown, we don't look particularly special here. This graph despite having the colours switched around, is very similar to the graph in Gates's book. It's approximately 30% for electricity, approximately like 25 to 30% for domestic manufacturing, approximately 17% for transportation. But a lot of people don't realise the impact of our exports. When you just take into account our coal exports, this dwarfs our domestic impact. It brings them down to about, I think 30% of our overall emissions profile, which means that if so much of our effort is going to decarbonising our own electricity or our own transport, we'll be tackling like 5 to 10% of what we could otherwise be tackling. And coal isn't our only export. When you factor in our iron exports, the emissions of our exports are absolutely colossal. Iron and steel production is something that almost nobody talks about with climate, and that is just a huge amount of the world's emissions. The world's steel production makes up 7% of the world's emissions. Australia's iron exports make up something like 4% of the world's emissions. This is multiple times all of the domestic climate impact of Australia combined. And it's something that almost everybody is missing at the moment, and is something that, it's a really interesting opportunity that is deeply unfocused on. Now, of course, there's debate. Of course, people could say here, well, if we haven't focused on that, is that because there's just not much that we can do about it? It might be that, things haven't been focused on for a good reason. Now, there's actually really, really good news here in that Australia is quite well placed for a lot of these things. Just due to our unique advantages, which I'll go into in a minute, Australia is better placed than almost any country in the world to decarbonise a few key industries that are major carbon producers in particularly hard to decarbonise sectors. In particular, manufacturing is an area that a lot of countries talk about manufacturing as one of the hardest to decarbonise areas. Johannes Akver from Founders Pledge, he talks about this quite a bit, where he thinks a lot about the counterfactuals of different kinds of climate impact, where if we were to decarbonise electricity or we were to decarbonise decarbonise transport, these are important areas, but if we don't do them right now, it's very likely that they'll be done in another 5 years. Whereas if we don't decarbonise manufacturing, that might be 30 years of climate impact before that gets undone. So the counterfactuals on decarbonising an area like this are quite strong. So what I want to talk about today is a way to ignore this but focus less on this 1.2% of global emissions that we currently cause, and focus more on how we could look at higher scale opportunities, on how we could decarbonise our exports, which currently make up between 6 and 9% of global emissions, and decarbonise iron and a few other sectors. So what this depends on fundamentally is Australia's unique advantages. So there are two different sectors here. One, our advantages are partly due to geography and partly due to our flaws. We are at present the world's largest exporter of iron. We export about 50% of the world's iron as like raw iron itself, and we as well as a number of other goods that almost no one talks about. Second, Australia has really unique geographic advantages. Metre per metre, Australia's solar panels are some of the most productive renewable energy generators in the entire world. And with a lot of manufactured goods, a lot of these are high energy goods. Whether you're looking at creation of steel, whether you're looking at creation of ammonia, whether you're looking at creation of methane, the vast majority of cost from these things comes down to energy cost. And if you can have a country that has deeply low energy costs, then that country is then the argument goes that country is more able to decarbonise those sectors than almost any other country in the world. Australia has among the world's best solar resources. Due to quirks of our geography, we have among the best wind resources, and that gives us the conditions for lower cost manufacturing than almost anywhere else in the world. Even when you look at Chinese manufacturing of steel, even when taking into account labour costs and shipping costs and things like this, these things are just dwarfed in comparison to the lower energy costs that we see in Australian manufacturing, especially when it comes to green materials. So the solution there is then to push with government for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. This is actually a plan that was initially put forward by Bob Hawke's economic advisor, Ross Garner. And essentially the thinking here is that we could bootstrap green industries. Australia has basically always been an energy exporter of one kind or another. What that looks like so far is us exporting coal and exporting natural gas. And over the next 100 years, those industries are going to die out just because the demand for these things is shrinking. So there is a huge economic opportunity here in terms of exporting other high energy goods. Essentially, being an energy exporter in the form of creating high energy goods in a place where energy is deeply cheap, and then sending those to places which cannot do that nearly as cheaply or nearly as efficiently. In that way, rather than just decarbonising Australia's domestic products, we can also decarbonise a huge amount of the steel market worldwide, a huge amount of the ammonia market worldwide. It's estimated that these things could be industries on the scale of the mining industry, which is just a huge economic opportunity, an economic win for the Australian government as well as a humanitarian win for the world, in that it could tackle a huge amount of climate change. It's estimated that if we follow this plan, our exports could decarbonise something like 6 to 9% of world emissions, which would put Australia among the top 5 most effective countries in the world at targeting climate change. There are a couple of countries which would have higher capacity than this, such as the US and China, just due to size and emissions profile. But this is quite a promising opportunity for Australian work. So in particular, if we look at steel, that is a huge source of the world's emissions. I think we've talked about this a bit already, so I'll skip over this one. But it makes up a huge amount of the world's emissions, expected to grow and quite unlikely to be decarbonised anywhere else. There are a couple of other countries that would be well placed to do this as well, where, for similar reasons to Australia, where if they have extremely good renewable resources. So, for example, Saudi Arabia would be well placed. However, there are different countries that are better suited for different parts of the world. So, for example, Saudi Arabia would be very well placed to decarbonise the steel industry for Europe and Africa, due to them having good shipping lanes and that being geographically close to them. In the same way, Brazil and Chile might be quite good at doing that for the Americas. But for Asia and Oceania, which makes up a huge amount of the world's emissions as well, there is basically no one better placed than Australia to do this. It is a huge economic opportunity. It's a win-win solution, and it is just a massive scale thing that we can do. Another approach that we can do is looking at ammonia. Ammonia is used as fertilizer, is currently a huge source of world emissions. It makes up about 2% of the world's emissions. Similar to iron, a huge amount of the cost of ammonia comes from energy cost. Methane, another 2%, huge amount coming from energy cost. If you have a country like Australia that has these just really gifted renewable resources, it is insane that we aren't taking advantage of that to be decarbonising these exports. So, with that in mind, we're looking this year at funding specific organisations that can push for this. So the theory of change here is that what we fundamentally need for new industries to be bootstrapped is funding from different groups in government. In order to get cooperation from government, what's needed, essentially, like from speaking to personnel working in government, what they've expressed is that what's needed is essentially planning. Governments are relatively okay at implementing on plans, but seem to be less proficient at coming up with these creative solutions. So if there can be NGOs out there who are coming up with comprehensive proposals, as they've done with the Albanese government's latest proposals, and as they've done with the Inflation Reduction Act, then there's very exciting opportunities that can be taken advantage of there. So the theory of change is essentially we fund organisations to do different types of government advocacy and different types of planning. Then governments establish financial support and a regulatory framework that can assist to push this forward. From that, producers are then able to switch to low carbon production and create a market for green materials that wouldn't otherwise be viable. And through that, we can decarbonise these hugely carbon rich these carbon-rich industries and avoid a very large amount of greenhouse emissions. So, with our current work, what we're working on at present is specific Australian charity recommendations. We're currently in the stage of identifying which organisations are specifically best placed to be implementing on plans like this. And then in the next couple of months, we're recommending specific organisations, working on this that can be, they can be funded to do so. So the question then is, what can we do? I think the main barrier at present is funding and creative solutions. So I think for people working to make a difference in this area, earning to give is a really viable area. People working in policy is a hugely impactful area here. People working in advocacy organisations to do with climate, there is a lot of really low-hanging fruit to be had there. So, and also we recently, for people interested in climate in general, we've also recently set up the Effective Altruism Australia Environment Fund to support other highly effective charities operating worldwide in the climate space. Cool. That's our breakdown of what we're thinking about effective climate work in Australia. I think now we're going to jump over to some questions and we can chat about it in more detail.
And fond of Jack, but nice to know the vision and work.
I've got to apologise for the coughing and spluttering, guys. Thanks so much.
I'm very glad that he was delayed. So, you mentioned that the recommendations are sort of finalised and looking about what Australian opportunities might be impact. But it's almost from your presentation, it sounds like something like an industrious labs, but based in Australia would be really amazing, right? Because there's this huge opportunity for these things to be. Is that what it's sort of like?
That's exactly right. And we found some organisations that look really, really promising here. There are a few like Beyond Zero Emissions and the Superpower Institute, which look to be doing very effective work in this space. That we're still narrowing down our exact recommendations, but something like Industrious Labs, but working in the Australian space, seems like it could be world scale. I think we went into this relatively. We went into this not particularly optimistic, thinking that the chance that any one country is the best place to decarbonise a certain sector is relatively low. But I think we've really updated on that, thinking that there might be things that are competitive on a world scale here, which is really nice.
Yeah, it seems sort of surprising in a way, right? That, of the over 100 countries that could be all working together to try to tackle climate change. The chance of Australia being one of the top ones that can compete with the task force that's been doing stuff around the world, it seems quite small. But you're sort of saying that just because of the our responsibility for carbon emissions, but also our natural resources, that we might be able to be amongst the
It's something that really surprised me as well, and I think I think there are definitely amazing opportunities to be had elsewhere, and possibly even stronger. For example, Industrious working on cement in China. I think that's something that is just such a impactful project. But for the Australian projects to have been as strong as they have was a real surprise for us, to be honest. It was really good. Yeah.
And as part of your sort of role, you've been talking about effective climate giving in Australia, and I guess for a long time, the effective altruism movement's been talking about effective global poverty, and you're trying to lead. You work as one of the one of the shining examples, effective way of tackling that. How is the climate change and environmental sort of movement and philanthropy space receiving the idea of thinking about cost effectiveness of something that might be a little harder to evaluate compared to give all charities that have got randomized trials?
So I think climate is necessarily just one of those areas where evaluation is more difficult, just because, as you say, you can't run randomized controlled trials on these things, and even if we can use analogs, the advancement of, say, solar technology is a very different scenario to the advancement of manufacturing technology and things like this. But to be honest, I think the difference is not between no rigor at all and then give well level rigor. I think the reception we've had has been incredibly positive of just having more strategy and more rigor in the space. And if we can be moving that from 0 to 70%, even if it's not to 100%, I think that seems to be something that people are receiving incredibly positively. Yeah.
You're sort of saying that even though you can't demonstrate through randomized trials that this is the one of the most cost-effective intervention to solve X, Y, and Z, you're still moving the conversation from a world in which the rigor is closer to the rigor is more variable, and you're sort of saying you can do quite a good job trying to evaluate.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing where there are certain tools that are available to you and certain tools that aren't. So in the absence of randomized controlled trials, it's very difficult to get to the exact level of rigor as GiveWell, for example. However, there are a lot of organizations which just aren't considering scale of impact much at all. And there are a bunch of organizations not considering tractability nearly as carefully as they should, or not considering neglectedness, not looking at the funding environment, and whether, people might be working on very, very effective stuff, but not considering, there's really interesting breakdowns out there of which break down global disease burden and compare that to funding for different causes of global disease burden. And there is often a huge disconnect there, where there might be a huge amount of disease burden from one cause, and there's little funding there, versus a small amount of disease burden from another cause, and then a huge amount of funding that goes towards that. And I think there's a strategic disconnect here in climate as well. So if we can be helping to guide people here and show, well, here are the areas that are systemically neglected. Here are the strategies that look good from a number of angles, be that expert interviews, be that literature reviews, be that whatever else. Then I think that even if we can't get to the level of GiveWell just due to the fundamental uncertainty around climate change, because it is one of those problems where you're just dealing with 4 or 5 different complex overlapping systems. Even if we can't get to that level of uncertainty, I think there's still a lot of improvement in rigor that we can make there.
Yeah. Okay. So you're sort of saying that there are things that you learn from thinking about the development environment where you looking at the burden of disease and the amount of funding that goes to it, that has not been imported over into sort of the climate change space.
Yes.
Do you want to give me a more specific example of that, where you feel there's a whole lot of energy and funding going towards in a specific sort of climate approach, and there's other parts that maybe are, you sort of alluded to that here, sort of talking about the fact that maybe there's a whole lot of energy from the Australian government going towards electric car subsidies, right? Where from what you put up on the pie chart, what transportation in Australia accounts for a fraction of our emissions. Is that kind of what you're alluding to?
Yeah, very much so. So to be completely honest, I'm pretty happy with what the Australian government's been doing recently, just because it is an indication that they're taking climate change really, really seriously. But were I to optimize that for impact, they've allocated something like $20 billion at the moment towards rewiring and expansion of our electricity, and of renewable electricity, and about $2 billion towards build out of a hydrogen economy. And I think that's I'm hesitant to criticize any climate funding, because I think all of it is people working to do really good stuff. But if I had an additional $20 billion, I definitely think there's areas like say agriculture or manufacturing, especially manufacturing in Australia, that seem like areas that could be quite a bit larger that people aren't realizing are really important yet.
Is there anything else that you learned from running, co-founding that you feel is very important in your own work at Getting Green?
I think a huge amount of what limits a lot of different approaches is just a capacity to scale. It is quite unusual to me how rarely anyone asks the question of how could I be doing what I'm currently doing 10 times better? And I think if we can regularly be asking that question of not how can I be 30% more effective, but how can I be 10 times more effective? I think there are quite a lot of opportunities that people miss just due to failures of ambition. And I think one reason we've noticed this is because we were looking for what are the like really high scale opportunities that Australia has, and I think there's almost a courage arbitrage to be had there, where there are a lot of really positive opportunities that get missed just because people aren't looking high scale enough. But often with stuff like this doesn't even look like there are other interventions that look quite important too. So one thing that is a big problem in Australia is vehicle emission standards, where a lot of our vehicles are much less efficient than vehicles in the US and Europe because we have different rules on how efficient our vehicles need to be. That's something that should be fixed. That'd be a good change to be had. But it's something that is dramatically smaller impact than taking care of our exports, and doesn't necessarily seem that different a tier of tractability. So it's the kind of thing where there are things that are higher scale that aren't necessarily more difficult in terms of tractability, and like those things don't necessarily scale one to one. And I think making sure that people can be remembering to think high scale where they can is there are often some really good opportunities there that get missed.
Yeah, right. So you're sort of saying in your time of leave, I guess with more funding, you had more that you could do. There were more countries that you could advocate for. So in a way, if somebody had this inherent like scalability of like what you're trying to effort, and then but in climate change, like when you're trying to find charity, you want one that has room for funding. So that if you pile 500 grand into that charity, they could do a lot more. Like what you're sort of saying is maybe there aren't things that have that 10x.
Well, kind of. What I was talking about with LEAP was the thing that LEAP did unusually was we were working on policy. It's like quite unusual for a lot of NGOs to work on policy approaches. A lot of them focus on direct implementation and things like this. The fact of the matter is, most of the time when you work on policy proposals, the scale of impact that you can have is dramatically larger. The regulation we passed in Malawi, it's estimated that that's prevented the poisoning of something like 215,000 children. In Pakistan, it's something like 1.2 million. That's not negligible. Now, the impact of, like, if we were to do that through a direct delivery program, the cost to do that would be so much higher, just because the comparative advantage of NGOs isn't in executing on the ground implementation of like person to person impact a lot of the time, and primarily because the advantage of NGOs isn't moving massive scales of money. Governments are really good at moving massive scales of money, and like kind of a lot of companies can be quite good at moving large scales of money. But if NGOs can be setting the framework for this kind of stuff to happen, then that can be really impactful. And I think when we started LEAP, people were relatively skeptical of policy approaches. But I think one thing that was really positive about it was it showed us that, hey, you can do things that are significantly larger in scale of impact. And scaling the impact doesn't necessarily require scaling the cost of input if you kind of choose the right strategy to approach that.
If you choose something that has a lever.
Yeah, that's it. If you choose the right lever to pull, then yeah, there's a lot more impact you can make.
Yeah, look at, people in the audience have sort of brought up some other like approaches that aren't policy necessarily related, or maybe these are like avenues that could be addressed either by direct work or by policy. Like, do you have any thoughts on things that are like, direct emission reduction projects, or things that target like air pollution, like a Clean Air Task Force, for example, like had a framing around their language that was not just carbon emissions, but it's like air pollution. Like, how do you feel about those as opposed to sort of the industry, like decarbonising industry kind of approach?
Yeah, so I think Clean Air Task Force are an absolutely incredible organisation. They do great work, but I think people often misunderstand a bit of their work as well. Where so they do direct emissions, but a huge amount of what they do in virtue of doing that, part of the reason they're doing that is to accelerate those technologies so that they get cheaper. At the current cost of carbon capture and things like that, it isn't that viable an approach. But I think part of their thinking is that in the same way that if 30 years ago you could be helping to fund and bootstrap the solar industry and make sure that solar technology gets cheaper faster, then that can be rolled out en masse. That's really positive. In the same way, if for carbon capture, we know that that's going to be a technology that's going to be essential for the solution to climate change. That's not something that's kind of made its way into the public dialogue yet, but when you look at the global climate reports, it's something that they all report. So I think one thing Clean Air Task Force are looking to do through this direct air capture work is to be kind of laying the foundation to get that technology cheaper so that it can be rolled out at scale. So I think in terms of the cost of direct air capture today, I think the cost today, if you were just counting the impact it has on removing carbon from the atmosphere, it wouldn't be a viable way to solve the problem. But I think the advantages in being able to get that technology to a place where it can be functionally used to solve the problem en masse is, I think, really powerful. And with climate, that's exactly what we need. It's a bit of an unusual problem that way. It's not like with bed nets. You can pay $3,000 and you're reasonably likely to have saved a life for those $3,000. With climate change, you can have impact, but it's really important that we figure out how to do that at scale. If we kind of tackle 10% of climate change, the impact of that is less than 9 times of 90% climate change. And I think, I think figuring out how we can get those solutions to scale is pretty critical for this problem.
Look, I'm glad that you are there trying to help us find those solutions. So can we all give Jack another round of applause?